Gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the World Forum on Fuel, Food and Environment, the Bioenergy Challenge. I would like to thank you all, to thank the various speakers that will join me this morning and this afternoon. I would like to join also the authorities that accepted the invitation to participate today to this discussion. And of course, I would like also to thank the organizers of the European Conference on Biomass, who did volunteer and accepted to dedicate one full day to the discussion of this very hot topic on how to develop in the future bioenergy, sustainability criteria, how we can develop bioenergy to satisfy energy needs, but also to consider the sustainability criteria. However, before we go in any detail of the discussion, we will be plenty of time to debate. I would simply like to invite the welcome speeches. So I would like to ask Mr. Maran, who is the councillor to the municipality of Milan, and of course is one of the organizations. So Mr. Maran, please, for the municipality of Milan. Thank you.
Dear guests, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here today and have the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Mayor and of the Municipality of Milan. I would like to warmly thank all of you. Fuel, food and environmental issues are particularly related to the theme chosen for Expo Milano 2015, Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life, moving reflection on the urban environment to a global scope, enhancing the local component present between the levels of change. Milan is working hard on this front, with a strategy that involves all aspects of its development, from mobility to buildings efficiency, from water to waste, with targets that aim to maximize the potential of energy processes in terms of efficiency and savings, as well as of diversifying the energy mix, promoting new fuels, alternative to fossil sources. In terms of mobility, with the start of Area C, our congestion charge, it was given a clear signal that looks at the zero-emission fuels as the expected real goal, not only for issues related to the climate change scenario, but also for the effect on the emission contest linked to local pollutants, where the main concern is human health. For this reason, Milan looks at new fuels, electric mobility, even in the meaning of fuel cells in public transport, through ambitious European projects such as CHIC. The city has been introducing biofuels in the public service fleet for a long time, related to the refuse collection service. The strategy for energy efficiency and alternative energies promotion in the construction industry provides a significant increased use of district heating, favoring the exploitation of waste and water cycle as alternative source. The exploitation of phreatic source through heat pumps of groundwater, the subject of a recent initiative of the Ministry of Environment, which has recently launched the project Relab, is an essential aspect of the operative scenario that lies ahead. With the choice of acting on our built and plant heritage, we want to give an example, subjecting a group of schools and institutions to pilot intervention in this regard. The municipal heritage of housing is an important peak as well, and thanks to a project approved under the European Union Smart Cities Programme, together with Politecnico di Milano, we can test a new method of intervention, which in addition to aspects related to the technological element linked to power generation, takes the topic of efficiency. The launch of the Municipal Energy Desk will provide an indispensable tool in this strategy of interaction both with citizens as consumers and the users of public service, and with the world of services and product supply, which constitute an essential lever for this change. In the Energy Desk, we intend to put all our capacity to imagine a better city, which responds to the need by moving the different components that come into play in the best of ways, diversifying also the use of available resources, such as the operators who have dealt up to new with the thermal control system, in accordance with the Law No. 10/1991. This resource will be committed to a project that aims to bring a new cultural model of energy in the area of decentralization, creating a joint which will be able to spread over time. All these actions are related to a strategy that are the basis of plans and programs current with the European goals, including the Covenant of Majors that bind us to the elaboration and the preparation of the Plan of Action for Energy and Climate. For Milan, the commitment is to make horizontal that constraint on efficiency, climate and renewable energies, on the whole range of planning tools which are a binding force and regulate the activities of the institution, beginning with the Sustainable Mobility Plan, which must contain concrete tools for the incentive of clean fuels and bioenergy. Finally, the aim to make more efficiency on the freight transport in urban area remain one of our main challenges, considering the contribution in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and the production of local pollutants that this sector produces. In this sense, we are taking the first step toward testing a system that combines ecological characterization of the means to a new system of tracking and control, which should lead us to an effective implementation of the regional requirement for the most polluting vehicles, which by themselves produce about 30% of emission from the traffic in Milan and Lombardy. The experimentation, which will use advanced technologies for tracking based on radio frequencies and the satellite recognition of Italian brand, can provide a valuable starting point for a policy of environmental control on the freight on a large scale, based on experiences that are beginning to take root in other parts of Europe and of the world. I wish you full success of this forum. I'm sure that the result of the work of these days will enrich the reflection of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maran. I forgot just to make a short announcement before we continue. The discussion this morning will be mixed English and Italian. So whoever you cannot understand Italian, that you are pleased to get your automatic translation. I know that you have plenty of possibilities, so please decide yourself. Now, after the Municipality of Milan, I would like to introduce Anne Glover. She is the Chief Scientific Advisor to the European Commission President Barroso, and therefore she will bring the addresses, so she will address the welcome from the European Commission. Anne Glover, please.
Giovanni, thank you. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here and have the opportunity to speak to you about what is an incredibly challenging issue. So what we're here to discuss is how we get the right balance in the use of land to produce food and to produce fuel. And this is critical for us. But just to set it in context, I wanted to make a few general remarks. Why are we so interested in bioenergy? Well, if you look at atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration, this is something we hear about a lot. It is absolutely a consensus that man is having a major impact on our planet. So if we look at the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and we can look at that historically using data which has been stored in ice cores in the Arctic or the Antarctic, we find that naturally carbon dioxide concentration varies from between 180 parts per million when it's cold to 280 parts per million when it's warm. As I speak to you now, we are at about 390 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the planet. So man is having a major impact. And why does it matter, that carbon dioxide? Well, let's just remind ourselves that this is a basic law of physics. It's like putting a fleece blanket round the Earth. It will just warm up. That's the impact. And if the Earth warms, lots of things happen. So we will get ice melting. That will mean an average global sea level rise. And as so many of our cities and populations live on the coast, There's an issue here. And just last week, we went over a boundary that we've never reached before, and that is a seasonal high of 400 parts per million CO2 in our atmosphere in the Arctic. That should make us all quite worried. So how do we address that? And that's why we're talking about bioenergy, because we're thinking of how to feed the world's population, and we're thinking of how to produce energy for that same population. And that's the other thing we need to remember, is that the last time there was a very high concentration of CO2 and we went through a very warm period on the Earth, there were very few people lived here at the time. So we were talking about hundreds of thousands or millions. We were not talking about 7 billion, which is the number of people we have on the planet today. And if you have 7 billion people, you become less resilient. It's not easy for people to move, because when they move, that causes problems. So we have a problem with number of people. And actually something I would just like to mention, which I heard just this morning, is that it's a very complex system we work in. So I've talked about the need for food, the need for energy. And probably you'll have heard about the obesity epidemic. So we are all getting fatter. Unfortunately, I have to put my hand up and say that I am fatter than I was 5 years ago. But one of the things I heard this morning is if we all became as fat as they are in North America, then effectively that would be as if there were 1 billion more people on the planet. Because if you're fatter, you need more food. Running might not always help. But it's an issue, because if we get fatter, we demand more food and we have to feed effectively more people. So there's the complication that we have. Now, how do we deal with it? So we can bring in policies, we can look for alternatives. The thing that we should never forget is that we should try to be more efficient. So that's the first thing all of us need to do. We're very relaxed about food and energy in the developed world. So we waste food and we waste energy all of the time. And surely that has to stop. But then fossil fuels are not going to provide ongoing energy supply to us. So we need to look at bioenergy. And that's what we're here to discuss in this conference, to see how we might best be able to engineer our policies so that we can incentivize the use of alternative energies to be able to deliver sustainable energy supply. And I think the biggest challenge that we have to face, is how we can deliver enough food for our population and how we can deliver enough energy for our population. And that means all 7 billion, not just the few who already have food and energy. So I would hope that we have a very stimulating discussion, and I'd have to say that it's not an easy discussion to have, because these things are never simple. You can use science evidence, which is what I'm most interested in, but I would just like to say that if you had a world that was only based on evidence, and that's all we ever paid attention to, it would be rather an unpleasant world to live in. It would be very sterile. So we need to get the balance right of what we can do to give us a secure future on the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And in fact, you did already open the debate and the discussion, because you already put the finger on many issues that need to be discussed today, like, of course, the climate change, the competition towards food and feed industry, but also human being. So the cultural problem, you know, looking at the food experience. And so I think you already mentioned something that we will debate very much. Now, as I said before, this day is part of the European Biomass Conference, but it's also a propedeutic debate for the Expo 2015, because, 2015 Expo is focused on the, let's say, feeding the planet, energy for life. So today can be seen as the very first step towards the Expo 2015. This is why it is my pleasure now, and I can now shift to Italian, if you allow me. È il mio piacere di invitare il direttore generale deputy il commissario infatti generale deputy per l'Expo 2015, dottor Paolo Alli, che appunto in tale veste porta i saluti dell'Expo 2015 organizzazione. Prego Paolo, grazie.
Grazie Giovanni. Do con grande piacere il benvenuto a tutti voi a nome del commissario generale e presidente della Regione Lombardia Roberto Formigoni, che ci raggiungerà tra poco. Saluto in particolar modo tutti gli autorevoli ospiti che partecipano a questa tavola rotonda, e è già stato detto da Giovanni De Santi quanto noi puntiamo a questo evento come apertura di un percorso di 3 anni che ci condurrà all'Esposizione Universale di Milano nel 2015, che appunto ha come tema l'alimentazione, Feeding the Planet, Energy for Life. Siamo a poco più di 1000 giorni dall'evento e la giornata di oggi diventa quindi particolarmente significativa. Un'esposizione universale che si svilupperà attorno a contenuti che sono fortemente attinenti a quelli odierni: l'alimentazione, l'agricoltura, la ricerca, l'innovazione, l'energia, l'ambiente, la mobilità, la sostenibilità. La nostra ambizione è affrontare in modo nuovo e autorevole alcune delle grandi e decisive sfide del mondo contemporaneo, che sempre di più orientano le agende politiche di tutti i governi. In questa direzione noi abbiamo dato vita a un percorso di condivisione e riflessione di altissimo profilo che vuole porsi come milestone nel dibattito internazionale su tutti questi temi, affrontandoli in tutta la loro ampiezza, senza forzature, senza prese di posizioni ideologiche, con un atteggiamento realmente ampio e comprensivo di tutte le sfumature ideali, di tutte le istanze, di tutti gli interessi in gioco. È una sfida affascinante. Noi vogliamo che l'Expo non sia semplicemente una fiera, ma sia un luogo di grande dibattito mondiale e di grande presa di consapevolezza da parte di tutti dell'importanza di queste tematiche. Credo che questo forum possa rivelarsi veramente un ottimo strumento di condivisione di linee guida rispetto all'uso delle fonti energetiche alternative, nonché di misure sul risparmio energetico, sulla riduzione delle emissioni inquinanti, come già Anne Glover diceva nel suo intervento introduttivo. Si tratta di sfide assolutamente prioritarie per tutti e in particolare per chi governa. Quindi anche il dibattito di questa mattina vuole proprio cercare di mettere a fuoco le azioni di governo che possano meglio orientare, attraverso un'alleanza fra tutti i livelli di governo, col mondo economico e con la società civile, valorizzando in una logica di sistema il contributo di ciascun soggetto. Occorre coniugare le esigenze di carattere ambientale con quelle energetiche, attraverso approcci differenziati in funzione dei diversi fattori in gioco. Serve quindi un confronto aperto tra tutti gli attori pubblici e privati per disegnare percorsi di crescita adeguati. Il tema dell'energia è una sfida strategica e trasversale, può essere vinta solo col contributo di tutti: istituzioni, cittadini, sistema delle imprese, enti di ricerca, lavorando prioritariamente al potenziamento delle tecnologie innovative. Quindi l'obiettivo è quello di utilizzare tecnologie e metodi di gestione sempre più avanzati che permettano di produrre meno inquinamento, perché l'inquinamento è ormai un costo troppo elevato per la nostra società. Sotto questo aspetto l'equilibrio da raggiungere si può tradurre in un fattore economico e di sviluppo. Infatti noi crediamo che sostenibilità non significhi conservazione e non significa neanche non fare. Le politiche ambientali devono assumere fino in fondo la responsabilità di incentivare i comportamenti virtuosi e di stabilire regole, se necessario anche severe. Come già stato detto, il tema dei biocombustibili e delle bioenergie ci interroga in particolare sull'uso dei terreni che vengono tolti alla produzione agricola a favore dell'uso delle biomasse per produzione di biocombustibili, accrescendo in talune aree del pianeta il problema della scarsità di cibo. Per reagire a questa drammatica contraddizione occorre anzitutto avere una cognizione esatta di questi fenomeni. Per questo noi crediamo che il sostegno allo studio e alla ricerca, all'elaborazione di modelli concettuali e di metodologie operative replicabili sia un elemento strategico per chiunque debba assumere decisioni relative allo sviluppo economico e sociale. Quindi benvengano incontri come quello di oggi, in grado di fare il punto della situazione e mi auguro di proporre soluzioni pragmatiche e innovative. Desidero sottolineare che l'Esposizione Universale di Milano del 2015 vuole anche contribuire a rispondere a questi interrogativi, all'interrogativo fondamentale: come sia possibile assicurare a ciascuno, in ogni parte del pianeta, cibo sicuro, sano e sufficiente. Certamente è possibile ragionare, dibattere, confrontarsi. Per questo il primo impegno del Commissario Generale di Expo 2015 è quello di proporre un documento programmatico che proprio in questi giorni è in fase di ultimazione e sarà presentato pubblicamente, un documento che vuole sollecitare tutti i partecipanti all'Expo già da oggi, quindi governi, mondo scientifico, mondo della ricerca, imprese, associazioni e anche i visitatori che verranno durante i 6 mesi di Esposizione Universale del 2015, a portare all'attenzione sulle grandi sfide legate al cibo: malnutrizione, tutela dell'acqua e della biodiversità, sprechi e eccedenze alimentari, volatilità dei prezzi alimentari, ma anche la convivialità, le identità culturali legate alle tradizioni alimentari, i simboli del cibo, solo per citare alcuni aspetti. Questo documento strategico sarà uno strumento tanto più utile quanto più saprà essere vettore di proposte concrete. Infatti il documento intende anche presentare una piattaforma di iniziative che ci auguriamo saranno condivise ampiamente da tutti i partecipanti all'Esposizione Universale. Quindi questi 3 anni servono per dibattere, per arrivare, speriamo, nel 2015 a una conclusione di questo grande evento che abbia anche un lascito immateriale, una legacy immateriale, che sia un contributo positivo per il mondo. Quindi in conclusione desidero rinnovare il mio ringraziamento agli organizzatori della conferenza europea delle biomasse per averci ospitato, al JRC in particolare al dottor Giovanni De Santi, ideatore di questo primo forum mondiale. Sono certo che la professionalità e la dedizione ai temi della ricerca e dell'innovazione in campo ambientale ed energetico ci consente oggi di raccogliere contributi, riflessioni da condividere nel prossimo futuro. Questi saranno strumenti fondamentali per raggiungere l'obiettivo di uno sviluppo più sostenibile per tutti. Auguro pertanto buon lavoro a tutti. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I appreciate it very much also that you already enlarged the discussion started by including clear demands on responsibilities. So the policymakers have to take decisions, have to say where to go, what to do. And this is exactly what we want to debate today. So your very last speech, I think, is the best introduction to the very first roundtable. As you know, for the program, we do have 2, let's say, moments, important moments. This morning will be a roundtable making confrontation between policymakers, scientists worldwide. So we want to give you and to understand worldwide what the solution could be, how which solutions, which decisions have to be taken, what are the situations in Europe, but not only Europe. And then in the afternoon we will discuss, if you like, more in depth on a scientific basis, so to understand what are the data available, what is possible, what is maybe that not possible, and so to feed the decision makers with clear, unbiased data. So this day will be very important, and then in the end we will try to get some conclusion which possibly will reflect the two moments. So what the decision makers have to decide soon, and how the scientific community can feed them with proper, unbiased, international, consented views. This, I think, is the purpose of this today's discussion. And so let me, I will invite now here on the table representatives from the most important international organization, again, to give us the flavor, the view at international level. Let me simply give you a very short synthesis what we want to discuss, what the problem is, what we want to discuss today. So if I simply look at the title of the roundtable, how can policymakers guide to a sustainable bioenergy solution? That's the fundamental question. So how can we develop, as Anne already mentioned, the bioenergy, which is definitely necessary, but should be sustainable, should not be just developed on a random basis, whereby without any coordination, without any kind of forward-looking procedure and mentality. So it's very important that it's based on scientific evidence, which is based also on political agreement, if possible, worldwide, or at least coordinated. Now, I'd like to start from this very first slide, now looking at the, let's say, Expo 2015, again, main thematic area. So feeding the planet, energy for life. Of course, feeding the planet is one of the big challenges, if not the challenge for the future, for the humanity. We need to guarantee sufficient food to the population, and we need also to guarantee sufficient energy for life. So a tenor of life which should be maintained, if not improved. These are sometimes controversial and conflicting, let's say, requirements. However, we need to address them both in a coherent way. So if you look at this long-term target, let's consider now how the agriculture markets and land use looks like at the moment. You see three main factors. Population growth. You know, all the forecasts we are going to grow. So in 2050, we might be more than 10 billion on the earth. Also, as Anne said, we are becoming fatter and fatter. So maybe it's a double increase of the population. So we need more food. However, the improvement on yields looks like as if it is not sufficient to match this population growth. So possibly we will not be able to match the population growth and the requirement for additional food by simply enhancing the agricultural yields, or at least we need something new, some maybe technical, technological, cultural revolution, or let's say improvement. And finally, the climate change. So these three factors already put the land resources under stress. And this causes two different types of consequences. From one side, physical consequences. So you see, if you do use too much grounds, then you can have soil degradation, if not erosion. If you use too much water, then you can have also cause salinization. You can also acidification and nitrate pollution because of fertilizer, which are maybe even too abundant. And then finally, deforestation and draining peatland could again cause an enhance in CO2 emissions. So these are physical consequences that we need to consider in our environment. On the other side, you also have other types of consequences which reflect, however, on which impact our daily life. So the fluctuating food price. We see already that since when bioenergy started, there are some claims that the food or basic food or crops did increase a lot. We have lands, of course, conflicts, water shortage, possibly development of poverty, social disruption, biodiversity loss. So you see how many parameters we need to discuss today how complex the situation is and how complex any choice, any decision will be, because you will affect all of these parameters. And this is why, again, we did try today to have representatives that do look at the same issue from different perspectives, from different angles. So from the FAO to the World Bank to the United Nations Environmental Programme to the European Commission to member states and so on, and scientific community. Now, on the present situation, which I just depicted, you can consider again the additional factor, which is the bioenergy. So we need to introduce on a situation which is already per se not an easy situation, we need to add an additional factor which will not make the situation easier, which is again the bioenergy. And this is what we want to discuss today. So how can we then introduce bioenergy? What is the bioenergy challenge? European Commission, as you know, put already a 10% target for the use of renewable energy in transportation by 2020. Now, out of this 10%, a large majority will be based on biofuels. And the biofuel of present generation is coming most from crops on agricultural land. This is the present situation, which again we need to debate and discuss today and to find solutions. Now, as you see, most biofuel are produced from crops grown on agricultural land. So, of course, there are potential consequences. There are definitely potential consequences on environment, economic, and social aspects. And if you do ever consider that something similar will be adopted outside Europe, so worldwide, then, of course, the impact will be much bigger, much more serious, and therefore we need, again, a kind of solution. So just to conclude here, my, let's say, very short introduction to the debate that we're going to have is the final question: how to accommodate the growth in biofuel consumption without putting pressure on the limited land resources and avoid undesired social and environmental effects. This is the basic question. It's not an easy question, but this is why we are here, and this is why we wanted to invite many experts and to have their own point of view and possibly to draw some common conclusions. So it is my pleasure now to introduce to you and to call here to join me on the podium the speakers of the very first roundtable. And I apologize because the first one is the Italian Minister for Environment, Land and Sea. He just called us on Friday that it was blocked in Rio de Janeiro because of the policy commitment there, political commitment there, so he will not be able to participate to the meeting. However, again, he was one of the promoters of this event, so I want to thank him and the Italian Minister for Environment for the support they gave us. Then we have Roberto Formigoni, who is, as you know, the president of Lombardia region, is joining us in a moment. I think will be here in a few seconds. And I thought that it was important, besides the European Commission, to have member states but also regions, because whenever you decide to do something and you need to implement these measures, then you go down to local level, and so the regions are important. The Lombardia region is one of the, let's say, richest and most important regions, so we are curious to know what they want to do in practice, so what are they planning. Then again, Anne Glover, if you want to join me now on the podium, again, I introduced you already, so you represent the scientific advisor, you are the scientific advisor of the President Barroso. Then I would like to invite Umberto Delgado Rosa. He is Director at DG Climate Change, still European Commission, so one of my colleagues. Thank you, Umberto. Then again, Hans van Steen, again, another colleague from the European Commission representing the Director General for Energy. So thank you, Hans, for coming, and I think it's very important. Presidente, buongiorno. I just introduced you so you can take place there. Grazie. So, just in time, perfettamente in tempo. È qui, guardi, Presidente. Ok, so, abbiamo il Presidente Formigoni, Anne Glover, Umberto, Hans. Now, Irini Malzoglu, she is from the FAO, so the of course, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, so she will represent the FAO point of view. Thank you, Irini. Thanks a lot. Now, Stefan Biringezu, he is representing the United Nations Environment Program and, in fact, the International Resource Panel for United EP. Thank you, Stefan, for coming. Then Govinda Timilsina is the World Bank, so the cash flow and the rich guy. So thank you a lot, Govinda, for coming, because it's important, besides scientific discussion and environmentalists, also to know in the end whether or not we do have the resources to implement the programs that we wish to. And now I would like to ask Maurizio Melis, who is a journalist from the Sole 24 Ore, who will join us and in fact will facilitate the discussion. Again, as I said before, there are so many parameters, so many conflicting views, so many conflicting interests, so many difficulties, so many barriers that, you know, not only we need to, as we did, to invite the best speakers, the best, let's say, representatives of the different international organizations, but it's also important to put them in a coherent way, in a discussion which makes sense. So, grazie Maurizio per venire e, ripeto, passo volentieri la palla a te perché tu possa, come preferisci, passare da uno all'altro in modo da avere un quadro d'assieme e poi arrivare, se è possibile, a delle conclusioni. So thanks a lot. I will join you, just providing some possible scientific background whenever the discussion will deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. I want to personally thank you, Giovanni, for inviting me here today. I know that most of people which is here today want to understand what is happening in the next future, also to decide how to invest, for example, on this field, on this industry, which is the biofuel one. So I would like to go straight to the point, and so I would like to Hans van Steen, head of Unit DG Energy of the European Commission, which is the direction which is more involved. Okay, yeah, here. More involved in the writing the new directive which we are waiting about biofuels, and that will fix the rules for considering sustainable biofuels. So I would like to understand what is coming, if you can tell us something.
Thank you very much for this. And good morning to all of you. We need to have this a little bit closer here. Thank you also for inviting the Director General for Energy to take part in this. I suppose we are here to give you a little bit the energy perspective of the issues, and indeed the energy perspectives of the key theme for this debate are extremely important, and they have, I can assure you all, our very fullest attention in the Commission. I'd like just perhaps to take a step backwards from your question to start with, because if we look fundamentally at what are our energy challenges today, I'd like to echo what Anne Glover said to start with, that the climate change challenge is by far the biggest global challenge that the energy sector is facing. I had the good fortune a couple of weeks ago to be actually invited to the Arctic, up to the islands of Svalbard, and there you can actually see climate change happening. Then it's not a question of discussing climate change, you can actually see it happening, and I can tell you it was one of the most frightening experiences of my life. So we need to do something about it. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, not only in the EU, but globally. In the EU, we have some other energy challenges that we cannot ignore either. Security of supply is such a challenge. Currently, the EU is importing more than half of its energy needs that's going to increase in the future. And in certain sectors, like the transport sector, this percentage is even higher because it is so highly dependent on oil. So we need to reduce our dependence on imported energy, in particular imported oil. And lastly, we cannot ignore in the EU that energy plays a critical role for the competitiveness of our industry. So it's all very good if we can deal with climate change, we can make our energy supplies secure, but at the same time we need to ensure that energy remains affordable. Renewable energy, which is what I'm responsible for in the Commission, plays a key role in tackling all of these challenges. And when I say renewable energy, that includes bioenergy, biofuels and biomass. That was why, in fact, we have already adopted some key legislation on this. In 2009, we adopted a directive on renewable energy, which sets binding targets for member states that they need to achieve, the share of renewable energy they need to achieve by 2020. That directive includes some very precise, specific, and we think strict criteria for sustainability for biofuels. We can go into details on those if you wish, but we are fully aware in the EU and in the Commission that biofuels can be part of the solution, but they do not come without problems. And those problems have to be dealt with, and that we have attempted to do by adopting some very strict criteria, both related to the greenhouse gas savings that biofuels needs to produce compared to fossil fuels. So if biofuels actually produce more greenhouse gas than they save, then obviously we should not promote them. We need also to make sure that biofuels are not produced on land that has certain characteristics that we need to preserve, like high carbon stock. So there are very precise criteria on that. And we need to preserve biodiversity. We do not want to cut down rainforests, for example, or destroy other areas of high biodiversity value. So all these things are already in place. I guess that's the good news. I suppose what you were referring to is that there are still a couple of small gaps. Some would say small, some would perhaps say big. We think that they are important gaps to be filled, and we are working very hard to do that. One of these is to do with indirect land use change. So the fact that if you produce biofuels on land which was already used for agricultural production, that agricultural production is displaced and produced somewhere else, and that might have some greenhouse gas impacts. That has to be looked at, and if possible, we need to come up with measures that can reduce such impacts. And secondly, for the moment, the criteria only relate to biofuels, so the liquid stuff that you use for transport. They do not relate to solid biomass, which is used, for example, for electricity and heating. And there we're also looking into the possibility of doing something on that. So we are on our way towards making the criteria even stricter, if you wish, and we think that is a very important thing. Now, if I have just a few more minutes, let me try and address you some of the key issues for this session here as well, which is, do we have enough land available to produce the biomass that we need? In fact, we know now very well how much biomass we need, certainly until 2020, because that member states have specified in their action plans which they have produced under the directive. So when we're looking at renewable energy today, almost half of the renewable energy we consume in the EU is actually biomass, which surprises many people because when they think about renewable energy, they think about wind turbines or solar panels, but in fact, the majority of the renewable energy we produce today is biomass, and that will remain like that until 2020, according to the plans. Do we have enough biomass available? Well, we think so, and we are basing ourselves on studies which have been done by, we think, internationally recognized institutions, including the IPCC, which looked at this also at a global level, and came to the conclusion that on a global level, we can triple our biomass for energy production, which is what we will need to do in order to meet our climate ambitions. So we think we can do that. We need to use more forestry and agricultural residues, so waste products which are not used today. We need, and that tags on to what you said, Giovanna, we need to increase our productivity, we need to get higher yields, and we need to be better at using marginal land or degraded land which cannot be used for other agricultural production. We can do all of these things, and we think that there is a big potential for that. But let me just end by saying we think it is absolutely essential to do it from a climate perspective, from a security of energy supply perspective. If we are looking specifically in the biofuel sector, there are certain transport needs that cannot be covered through anything else but biofuels. I'm thinking of aviation, I'm thinking of long-distance road transport, I'm thinking of shipping. For shorter-term road transport or shorter-distance road transport, we can have great hopes for electric mobility and electric vehicles, but they're not going to be available straight away. And in the longer term, we cannot really imagine electricity to be the key fuel for our transport sector. We will need biofuels, and we will need sustainable biofuels.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Weinstein, I know that there are two proposals on the table in European Commission to decide what kind of rule to establish for decide which biofuel is sustainable and which is not. So I would like to ask to Umberto Delgado Rosa, which is the director of the DG Climate Change, if you have a different position, which are the two proposals on the table today in the European Commission?
Thank you very much. This is near enough. Sorry. Okay. Well, as Hans brought you all the energy perspective, I can bring you the climate perspective, but you'll be maybe disappointed to see that they are not contradictory. I'll try to see. So let me just
discussing.
Yeah. I'll just put in context all the whole issue, and I'll get to also the iLook and other aspects. But just to say, as context, I think we can all agree that probably the challenge of this century is the transition to sustainability. Let's say globalization as globalized unsustainability. And in this sense, it's very clear that bioenergy will have a role. But we should not forget, is bioenergy inherently sustainable? I would say no, it is inherently renewable, but the way to make it sustainable will depend in the way we exploit it, and also exploiting it in such a way that it does not bring unsustainability to other important sectors, for instance, to food. This is the context in which we strive. Now, getting to, let's say, the climate dimension of sustainable biomass. Nowadays, the European Union, we know very well where we want to head in the long term, to 2050. It was endorsed by the European Council that we are to reduce 80 to 95% of our emissions in relation to 1990. And we have tackled, of course, the ways to do it. That's what is in the 2050 low-carbon roadmap, for instance, identifies technologies and suggests a certain rhythm to get them in the most cost-efficient way. And the journey for 2050 has already started. We also have targets for 2020, which are the well-known targets in the climate and energy package. The 20% reductions, maybe 30 if others do their share of emissions, the 20% of renewable energy, and the 20% of reduction of consumption of primary energy. So in all this, biomass is to play a pivotal role. Because it is important in three main uses. It is important for electricity production, it is important for heat production, and there's the transport dimension, biofuels, that Hans has already mentioned. Let me then get first to the quantity issue. The supply of biomass for renewable energy, well, for our 2020 targets, it should double the quantity that we'll likely use. For 2030, grossly to triple, and for 2050, grossly to quadruple. But I reinforce what Hans said. Technically, if we look to the sheer quantity, theoretically, the potential is there. You can also identify, for instance, in Europe, that the way that forests are exploited is not equivalent in mid-Europe in relation to North or South Europe. So there's a lot of efficiency, and on building an effective supply chain of waste residues from forests, etc., that can be developed. Of course, a big part of biofuels and bioenergy is to come from agriculture, and there also we'll need quite a better supply chain, more efficient, not compromising food security, the environment, not distorting the markets. But we think even for this side, there are some opportunities to be tapped. For instance, if we look to the common agriculture policy and the budget that is coming in for the next budgetary period, there are opportunities for local biomass applications of electricity and heat, which we think will give the better return in investment, maybe helping to tap not only reductions in emissions, but also local employment, lower environmental impact, and some efficient use. Now, but how to get to sustainability? Let me address what we think are likely three important criteria. One would be land use management overall. For instance, biodiversity has been mentioned. I have the intuition that biodiversity is a good token for unsustainability. If we are losing it, we're likely to be unsustainable. If we are not losing it, likely to be sustainable. Well, the sheer most relevant driver of biodiversity reduction is not pollution or overexploitation, it's land use change. So land use change in this debate of biomass is very relevant indeed. And we will be in the Commission looking to it from the side of the bioeconomy strategy and the resource efficient strategy, more work on how to in a world of increasing population, we can get to bioenergy within this wider perspective of resource efficient land use. Second relevant criteria is the efficient use of biomass itself. As I said, it is not finite, it is renewable, so the quantity issue and its management. In this, it is fundamental to take into account the climate mitigation potential as replacements for fossil fuels. This is one key aspect. We don't want bioenergy per se, we want it per its effects. And the second question is to direct towards the sectors where little or no alternative exists. Let's go again to biofuels. Can we imagine a world without aviation? Well, aviation is dependent on fossil fuels nowadays. I don't think we'll have nuclear planes in the air nor electric. So likely biofuels is one option. So if we won't have biofuels for everything, at least we should have it for aviation. That's one of the ideas. And the third criteria, which is very important, that Hans also addressed, is carbon storage. We must take into account the impacts of uses and policies on the amount of carbon stored in forests and soils. There's more CO2 in soils than in the whole atmosphere nowadays, and all the plant biomass too. So we cannot use all soils and all carbon stocks. Some must just stay preserved as they are. On some policy instruments, one is, of course, the indirect land use change, and very plainly, it must be taken into account. As I said, for bioenergy in general, we don't want biofuels just per se. We want biofuels if they do reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we will be tackling a legislative proposal. I don't think we have opposing views. We have complementary views.
But you have different solutions.
No, not different solutions. We want to tackle, we have different directives. There is the Fuel Quality Directive, there is the Renewable Energy Directive. It would be totally awkward to have incompatible or incoherent solutions in each of them. So what we are tackling is exactly how to make one single proposal that makes them coherent. But I'm convinced that we will indeed take into account indirect land use change. Let me just call attention also to another policy instrument, which is the decision we are proposing for accounting emissions of land use change and forestry, the famous LULUCF, which will help Europe to track the effects of increased bioenergy and the increased carbon sequestration potential. It can help us also to put a carbon tag, a carbon cost on land use change in the European Union, and it will help us to comply to what international negotiations in climate can bring us on land use change, and forestry. So to finalize, I think that indeed bioenergy is needed for a more resilient and more sustainable society, and we must tap it in such a way that it delivers the sustainability we are seeking for. If it does, it can even give some further gains on smart growth, green economy, and green jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rosa. Ora vorrei fare una domanda al Presidente Formigoni, al quale vorrei chiedere anzitutto come pensa la Regione Lombardia, che si troverà a un certo punto a dover recepire i regolamenti arrivati dall'Europa, poi a loro volta recepiti dagli Stati nazionali, e in particolare ecco, che ruolo vede per le regioni in questa partita dei biocombustibili. La Lombardia è una delle regioni italiane, ma è anche una delle regioni europee, se vogliamo ragionare in questi termini. Ecco, che ruolo possono avere queste entità in questa partita?
Grazie. Innanzitutto vorrei dare a tutti voi il benvenuto in Regione Lombardia. Grazie per la vostra presenza, grazie per il contributo che date a questo importante convegno, e vorrei anche dirvi che nello svolgere il compito di commissario generale per l'Italia dell'Expo Milano 2015 abbiamo voluto dare un forte contributo a questo convegno. È il primo di una serie di meeting che saranno dedicati come preparazione al tema generale dell'Expo 2015, che sapete è nutrire il pianeta energia per la vita. Quindi questo è uno degli appuntamenti che vogliono preparare al meglio quel grande appuntamento da maggio a ottobre del 2015. Entrando nella risposta alla domanda che mi è stata fatta, io innanzitutto voglio sottolineare che ritengo che il fattore guida per l'ottenimento degli obiettivi del 20-20-20 debba anzitutto passare attraverso il risparmio energetico, un forte e condiviso impegno sul tema del risparmio energetico, che rappresenta anche una vera opportunità di sviluppo per i settori produttivi, quindi non è da concepirsi come una penitenza da subire, ma come un'occasione da cogliere e da sfruttare. Attraverso il risparmio vengono liberate risorse che vengono rese disponibili per ridurre il gap di competitività che le nostre aziende hanno a causa degli elevati costi dell'energia. In Italia l'energia costa mediamente il 30-40% in più rispetto agli altri paesi europei, ma risorse che potranno anche essere investite in tecnologie, innovazione e capitale umano. Il risparmio energetico include inoltre la necessità di ottimizzare gran parte dei cicli di utilizzo delle risorse naturali, caratterizzando la loro gestione secondo un principio di efficienza e di riduzione degli sprechi. Quindi a beneficiarne non è soltanto il tema dei cambiamenti climatici, bensì anche la qualità dell'ecosistema nel suo complesso, ed è per questo che Regione Lombardia dedica a queste politiche una particolarissima attenzione. In che modo? Quali sono gli strumenti operativi che Regione Lombardia ha messo in campo? Vorrei parlarvi innanzitutto di un piano che abbiamo chiamato Piano per una Lombardia sostenibile, che è lo strumento con cui decliniamo a livello regionale gli obiettivi 20-20-20, ma è anche e soprattutto un programma trasversale che mette a tema la sostenibilità come elemento di sviluppo economico del sistema. La green economy è una formidabile spinta attraverso l'utilizzo delle fonti rinnovabili al miglioramento della qualità dell'aria, all'efficienza energetica, alla riduzione dell'inquinamento. Per questo piano la Regione ha stanziato 900 milioni di euro, a cui si affiancheranno altrettante risorse messe in campo dai privati, e contiamo attraverso questo pesante investimento a creare 50.000 nuovi posti di lavoro di qualità nei prossimi anni nella nostra regione. Questo piano si articola in una serie di azioni, sono 75, alcune che abbiamo chiamato verticali a breve e medio termine, altre che abbiamo chiamato trasversali a lungo termine. Le prime azioni verticali riguardano 5 ambiti: le imprese, gli edifici, la mobilità, le reti infrastrutturali e il territorio, e contiamo di avere un risparmio di emissioni di CO2 attorno a 600-700 mila tonnellate. Le azioni trasversali, quelle a lungo termine, riguardano 7 ambiti: gli enti locali, coinvolgiamo gli oltre 1.500 comuni di Lombardia, le 12 province, riguardano ancora il tema della mobilità e degli edifici, l'assorbimento specifico del CO2 e ancora una volta le imprese. Oltre al piano edilizio, tra i principali interventi dico una recente norma che abbiamo approvato per la diffusione della geotermia, la definizione di nuovi criteri di progettazione per la realizzazione degli edifici, la promozione e la diffusione degli impianti a metano, interventi di forestazione e gestione delle aziende agricole e la riforma del trasporto pubblico locale. Proseguo sempre schematicamente. Un secondo strumento che mettiamo in campo è destinato alla crescita di un modello di generazione distribuita per introdurre non soltanto in Lombardia, ma attraverso la Lombardia, che è la regione più grande e più produttiva d'Italia, nell'intero Paese, un modello energetico diverso, un modello che abbandoni il concetto di energia centralizzata per convogliare invece su generazione distribuita, smart grid, valorizzazione del produttore consumatore, il cosiddetto prosumer, sviluppo delle rinnovabili con una forte spinta verso sistemi di efficienza supportati da nuove tecnologie. Secondo noi il fattore chiave su cui agire è l'integrazione tra politiche energetiche e politiche ambientali, che siano riunite in una nuova visione integrata. Questo ci ha spinto ad intraprendere il ridisegno della pianificazione energetica regionale, e questo è il terzo strumento che abbiamo messo in campo, un nuovo programma energetico ambientale regionale che definisce le modalità per far fronte agli impegni del 2020, coniugando lo sviluppo delle fonti energetiche rinnovabili, il risparmio energetico, l'efficienza energetica, con l'obiettivo ambientale di migliorare la qualità dell'aria, ma anche appunto ottenendo risultati sul rilancio economico. Tenete presente che la Lombardia è leader indiscusso italiano nel campo delle energie rinnovabili. Se guardiamo gli ultimi 10 anni, l'uso delle energie rinnovabili in Lombardia è cresciuto del 440%. E poi, e concludo, un'occasione straordinaria per il mondo imprenditoriale è data dal fondo Kyoto. In Italia sono stati sbloccati 600 milioni di euro sotto forma di finanziamento agevolato, e di questi 660 milioni di euro sono riservati alla Lombardia per i prossimi 3 anni. Noi calcoliamo nella nostra regione di poter generare 120 milioni di euro di investimenti aggiuntivi, e anche questa è una misura dalla quale ci aspettiamo risultati anche in termini di nuovi posti di lavoro. Quindi la chiave miglioramento energetico, miglioramento climatico e ambientale, aumento dei posti di lavoro, occasione per le imprese, è la chiave giusta con cui guardare a questo tema. Grazie.
Grazie Presidente. Questa overview sulle iniziative della Regione Lombardia. Now I wanted to make a question to Stefan Brinze, United Nations Environment Program, International Resource Panel of UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program. For example, I want to go back to the the proposal, the possibility, the way to rule the sustainability of biofuels. And I know, for example, that in California it is already implemented a way to rule the biofuels that introduce an I-look factor. Do you think this is a good idea? Do you think this is the right way to rule the biofuels, and which are the alternatives?
Thank you very much, Maurizio, dear ladies and gentlemen. Before I come to the I-look factor, which is about the assessment of biofuels for transport, this conference and the World Forum is about bioenergy. And therefore I would like I would like to start with the observation that there are very different forms of bioenergy, not just liquid biofuels for transport. And also the assessment is quite different. So as soon as we are dealing with taking out the energy from bio-waste by fermentation or incineration, this is usually much sensible to do so and has many benefits. However, if we are dealing with liquid biofuels for transport, we need to talk about the global implications of first-generation biofuels. And then our perspective needs to be widened, and we have to consider also the global land use for all agricultural products. And there we see the main trend that within the coming decades, global cropland will expand only to feed the world. Only for the provision of the growing population with a changing demand for more animal-based diet. This will require also more cropland also for the provision of the feed for the animals. And this rate is growing faster than the rate of the increase of the hectare productivity. And any additional demand for non-food biomass, either for fibers, for biomaterials, or for biofuels, will add to the pressure of converting cropland. And this goes at the expense of grasslands, of savanna, and partially also forest, mainly in tropical regions, at different places, of course. A couple of years ago, our colleagues of mine from the Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment made a report assessing biofuels. And Ravindranath and colleagues made some assessments on the greenhouse gas effects of first-generation biofuels. If globally we would take 10% of our transport fuel demand in 2030, and supply this with first-generation biofuels. This would require us between 100 and 500 million hectares, depending on the technology. And because this would add to the ongoing expansion for food supply, would also be associated with increased greenhouse gas emissions due to the plowing of the soil, due to the eradication of the existing vegetation above ground, and so on. And only in the year 2030, the order of magnitude which could be saved by first generation of biofuels of carbon dioxide would be 0.2 to 0.8 gigatons. That would be the savings. But the additional emissions due to land use change only in this year would be between 0.8 to 1.8 gigatons. So you see there would be a high chance that by means of that technology of first generation of biofuels worldwide towards 10%, there would be a high risk that we would have additional greenhouse gases contrary to what we in effect want to achieve. In addition, there would be of course also some risk with regard to the depletion of biodiversity due to the conversion of savannas, grasslands and so on. And we should keep in mind that we also our countries have signed the Convention on Biological Diversity, which calls for a halt of biodiversity loss, and we should do so until 2020. And from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, we know that the conversion of habitats, also due to the expansion of cropland, is a major driver of that biodiversity loss. From our analysis at the Wuppertal Institute, we know that EU 27 is already a land importer. We have a net import of land, of cropland, of more than 30 million hectares due to our consumption of all agricultural goods, food, non-food, which is opposite to the usual finding with regard to the foreign trade balance, which is different in currency, because the value of our exports is higher than of the imports. But in physical terms, it's the opposite. And when we look at the data, we are 30% above 0.20 hectares per capita, which could be deemed kind of a reference value, which we should drive forward, which would be, say, a reference of a safe operating space in 2030. We are already above. And then it comes the question, what is the effective policy means to that? Well, I think very clearly, in a situation where the global cropland will grow anyhow for food supply, any certification of biofuels demanding to take the biofuels from already cultivated land is completely ineffective to control land use change. It will only lead to a shift of land use towards the non-certified products, and this is the majority. So one should be very realistic in the expectation on the effectiveness of certain instruments, although we have quite a lot of examples where certification makes much sense. But in this case, it is probably not effective, and we should, as President Formigioni rightfully said, have an eye on the efficiency of our biomass use. We should improve the efficiency of biomass use in reducing our waste, which is enormous. We should, our food waste, we should increase the fuel efficiency of our car fleets, and last but not least, because obesity has already been mentioned in this morning, we should strive towards a more healthy diet, heading towards a more Mediterranean, less animal-based food, which would have a tremendous effect on our real land footprint. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brinzu. Vorrei porre adesso una domanda a Irini Malsoglu. Parlo italiano perché lo parla benissimo anche lei, probabilmente essendolo qualcosa del genere. Ma ecco, che cosa sta succedendo? Mi chiedo che percezione ha la FAO di quello che sta accadendo un po' in giro per il mondo in seguito allo sviluppo dei biocombustibili. Vi sembra che complessivamente, laddove vengono sviluppati, il bilancio socio-economico e ambientale migliori, o invece, come ci ha anche spiegato adesso Stefan Brinzu, i problemi sono moltissimi. Sul piano ambientale la prima generazione di biocombustibili è stata fallimentare in molte situazioni dal punto di vista del bilancio ambientale, con poche eccezioni. Ecco, la vostra percezione qual è e quali sono le ricette che eventualmente suggerite?
Grazie. I'll take the question in English.
Sì,
My
sì,
working
certo.
language is
Yes.
English. Okay, thank you very much. I would also like to add a bit of a different perspective to the issue. Up until now, we've really been talking a lot about a developed country context. Instead, perspectives do change a lot when we move into a developing country situation. So just to bring some numbers to the table, as you probably know, 2.7 billion people are still lacking access to energy, so they use traditional biomass for cooking and heating, and 1.3 billion people lack access to electricity. So this is a huge number. Talking about obesity, I would also like to draw a similarity to energy. There's a huge discrepancy in energy use. We could maybe even use the term of energy obesity. So developed countries have huge levels of energy consumption, all the way down to sub-Saharan African countries where energy access is zero or minimal. So this is the context we are against. These are obviously agriculture-based countries, heavily reliant on the agriculture sector, where most of the poor are also housed. So in that type of setting and in that type of situation, the overarching question is, what options do I have on the one hand to get economic growth going, to address poverty and to address the agriculture sector, and on the other, to actually improve energy access. So this is the backdrop against which we are trying to work in the FAO context. So around 2007, a number of countries came to us asking for assistance, asking exactly this question. So can bioenergy develop without hindering food security? We, at that stage, took a step back and really needed to assess the situation. Today, I would say that we have constructed a methodology to look at the situation, and we would definitely take it on a case-by-case scenario. You need to look at the country situation, you need to look at the country context, you really need to understand which the main food crops are. Are we talking about maize? Is production within the country a problem? Are they heavily susceptible to external prices? It is obviously extremely complex. If, for example, you're talking of a net food importing country, then they would be heavily vulnerable to any changes in food prices and to domestic food production. And often that is also combined to being a net energy importer, which makes it even more complicated. So what I would tend to say is to look at the country situation, first of all, to look at if there's any potential to produce bioenergy within the country, having taken out protected areas, having taken out biodiversity sensitive areas, and also considering domestic food production. So again, to go back to the developing country context, these are not countries where yields are extremely high. These are countries where yields are extremely low. So the point here is investment. Can bioenergy attract very much needed investment in an agriculture sector that is not efficient, is underperforming, so as to increase production, both, and I underscore, both for food and for energy? And so we need to go back to which feedstock are we talking about. In our case, we looked a lot at the example of cassava. Cassava is a complicated crop. It has some issues from the agronomic point of view, but it is an example of a crop that could be used for both food and for other uses like energy in this case. But again, we are talking of increasing production. We're talking of countries where production can be increased so that there is no competition with food. So just to close the loop, I think we really need to talk about the country context. It is extremely complicated. We also work with countries that are in post-conflict situations where land tenure is very problematic. So it comes down to how you construct the sector. We are not looking at large-scale investment. We're looking at an integrated approach. We're looking at bringing the smallholders in, have the outgrowers, the smallholders, the small farmers benefit from this process, trying to do something for local development, local markets, local energy access, and being aware of the risks. So which household groups, which groups of the population are going to be negatively affected from this development? But for the country overall, would it be beneficial? Drawing the sums, as has been mentioned before, so that then you can decide on a way forward. It's not something I would say that can be done just, you know, like con lo schiocco delle dita. But it does take real analysis. You need to develop your policy on evidence-based information of the country. So looking at the country, looking at land planning, looking at the specific biofuel chains, and which vulnerable segments of the population might lose from the development. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Tim Elsina, Development Research Group, the World Bank. You have a similar point of view, perspective on the whole world. So I think that you probably agree with the fact that we must design different politics for every country. But what's your point of view on this issue?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very important event. I fully agree what Irene from FAO mentioned about the concern from the developing countries coming from the World Bank, so I have the same hat on my head. Basically, whenever we are talking about the policy landscape, first of all, I like to stress that the policy landscape should be dynamic, not static. So the situation has been changed compared to the 2008 when we have a global food crisis. And biofuel was pointed as one of the culprits for the global food crisis. Perhaps we did not have enough studies, we didn't have enough resources, but over the last 4 years, we have a lot of hundreds of research have been carried out. A huge knowledge base has been built up, and any policy guideline should be benefited from this new knowledge base. So any blanket policy, for example, 10% at the world level, let's go the biofuel 10% at the global level. I do not agree with this type of policy. The policy should be country specific, based on their demand. For example, we have a more highlight here from the EU perspective, more on the climate change mitigation. This is perfectly valid concern. But if I'm coming from sub-Saharan Africa, my concern is something different. I do not contribute in the global GHG emission. It's a negligible contribution. My concern is not the climate change mitigation. My concern is that if I'm oil importing country, can I substitute my oil bill through my biofuel produced domestically without causing any effect on food supply? I can give some example. In some sub-Saharan Africa, if the country can use even 2% of this total arable land, cultivable land, not forest land, they can meet entire petroleum demand of their country in the next 20 to 40 years. So that means they can do it. But the question is that, is biofuel produced through this is competitive in the global market? If not, then why should they put the public finance, taxpayers' money to subsidize the biofuel if the petroleum product is cheaper for them? I think that's why the policy instrument should be devised based on their demand and based on the resource base, based on the knowledge available. Normally what happens in many countries is that the policy moves first and the resources come second. They try to analyze the policy when the policy is already introduced. I think it should be all the way around. First, it should be clearly and thoroughly examined, then that knowledge should provide the guidelines for the policy making. And there is a very optimistic view if I go to the scientific community of working on the biofuels, looks as if we are trying to substitute the entire fossil fuel by biofuels. I think that is not the case. In the realistic way, biofuel is only one of the options in the clean energy supply domain. We have a wind, we have a solar, we have a geothermal, we have so many other options. This is not the case that we are entirely wiping out the petroleum product through the biofuel. It's not possible physically, and there is no way of doing it economically. So then what is the expectation here? And that expectation also helped to develop the policies. We are talking about biofuel to the extent it does not create another problem of the food supply. So when we see some of the research recently developed, they are suggesting that if we go about 8, 9, or 10% of the biofuel in most of the countries, it will really not create that big a problem we are talking about. I mean, that is doable. So that is doable economically, that is doable physically also. So let's be very clear that we are not talking about to replace completely the fossil fuel through the biofuel. That is not the case. Biofuel is only one of the part of the solutions. And again, one thing I would like to highlight is that the food is first. Whenever we are developing the policies to promote the biofuels, we have to take into account that the food is first, the population is growing, and the quality of the food demand is increasing because of the higher income level in developing countries, particularly the middle income countries like India, China, Brazil, and so on. So we have to devise the policy in a way that biofuel can contribute in a sustainable way without creating any problem in the other sector like the food supply, but still having its limited role in the global energy supply dimension. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Anne Glover, Chief Scientist Advisor to European Commission President Barroso, we just heard that sometimes politics come first and advantage comes after. So do you think how can science and the scientific community contribute to distinguish bioenergy, which is a part of a solution, from bioenergy, which is a part of the problem? I mean also, which kind of behavior must have the scientific community to address in the better way the politics?
So this is a really interesting question. First of all, if we just think about the energy context again, let's remind ourselves that there are only two things on the planet which are effectively infinite for our use. Everything else is restricted. The two things that are infinite are solar energy and gravity. So that's all we've got on the planet that is a continual source of supply. Everything else is finite, and that certainly includes soil and our ability to either grow biofuels or to grow food. I think the really important thing is that from all the contributions you've heard, it's clear that it's a very complex issue. It's not just, okay, let's now use biofuels, so we just put land at the disposal of growing biofuels. So the most important thing we can have, in my view, is very high quality, credible evidence. And that means doing the science. And from the Commission's point of view, the Commission has a science service, the Joint Research Centre, and they've done excellent work in being able to look at the issues, because it's not straightforward. Everything we do has impact. So I really liked Stefan's comment about the EU being a net importer of land. We're also a net importer of water. It all has to come from somewhere, and we don't tend to think of it holistically. So first of all, let's generate the evidence, let's generate the scientific evidence, and let's look at the impact of everything that we might do. So if we grow biofuels on land that used to be used for agriculture, what does that mean in terms of greenhouse gas emission? What does it mean in terms of other land that might need to be used? And we can put numbers on this. It's very important that we do it. And then we need to think about the policy. So the policy needs to take into account that evidence. And it's not always a straightforward equation where if you do this one thing, this other thing comes out. So the policy is quite challenging. And Govinda also said there, and a point I would agree with strongly, is that policy actually needs to be evolving. It needs to be imaginative and fluid. It can't be static, because our evidence base, we're all the time generating more and more evidence, and we need to use that evidence intelligently, because I probably don't need to remind you, but evidence is a very precious thing. It costs a huge amount of money to generate evidence. So once you've got it, you really need to use it. Otherwise, we're crazy. So we've got the evidence, and that should feed into the policy. But policy is terribly important, because you can come up with a policy which generates directives or legislation. People need to then react to that. So you need people who will invest in future technologies. And if you're going to invest, you need some degree of certainty. So here's the other dilemma. So you want policy to be flexible, but the people who are going to invest and deliver for you that different or better future, those improved fuels with more sustainability, less greenhouse gas emission, they need to invest. Investors need to know that the business will be secure. So you have to think about that scenario, and it's a very difficult one. And although I don't want this to sound like an advert for the Joint Research Centre, there's imagination there which I like, because it brings together the science evidence, but also the social science and the economic science, which we add together with that to try and develop things in terms of policy which are very valuable. The reason, just the last thing, that we need to use the evidence, and that must be the basis of policy. But I made a plea there for flexible policy, and policy needs to be compatible across different areas. So we need to be thinking about enterprise and business, we need to be thinking about climate, we need to be thinking about energy, and lots of different areas, environment as well. So there's not a conflict here. There needs to be a harmonization in how we deliver smart policy, innovative policy, and how we deliver that. So we need to coordinate across the different areas. And most importantly, we need to encourage innovation, because we're talking largely at the moment about first-generation biofuels, where we're using essentially food crops. We need to think about second-generation biofuels, where we're looking at waste and non-food crops. And then there's third-generation biofuels, where we might be harvesting the sun's energy, for example, in algal growth to be able to generate energy, which would require very little land, and so could be an enhanced sustainability option for us in the future. But to be able to get from where we are now, first-generation biofuel, to third-generation biofuel, we need to invest in the research, and we need to take note of the evidence that is generated. And we need to think of policy instruments that don't just encourage what we have here and now, but policy instruments that keep looking forward into the future and allow us to develop and accelerate the new technologies, because that will help us move towards greater sustainability. But the one thing I would say is, it's the plea for evidence, is that for every policy development, we need to do a health check and go back to the evidence and all the time be able to be procuring better and better evidence which makes our policy smarter and smarter.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Glover. Giovanni De Santi, il direttore del GRC, insomma il GRC è molto impegnato nello studiare, nel cercare di valutare, di tirare fuori queste evidence di cui stiamo parlando. C'è stato un accenno per esempio ai carburanti seconda e terza generazione. Ecco, voi come vedete il futuro da questo punto di vista? È qualcosa anche che sta arrivando? Possiamo essere ottimisti o dobbiamo pensare, perché se pensiamo per esempio, if we think of what happened with the photovoltaics, we found that the price of photovoltaic is going down 3-4 times in few years. So what we expect is a fast changing of the technology for second generation and third generation of biofuel, or is something that we must wait for a long time?
Yes, thank you. So scientific stability to support dynamic politics. That's the dilemma. We should be firm and give them some unbiased data to provide them, however, to move ahead. So I really support what Hans said, that we need to encourage innovative technology. So GSE, as again the technical branch and scientific branch of the Commission, of course, supported our colleagues within the Commission, collaborating also with stakeholders to provide the best possible scientific base for whatever discussion. And you see on my back, how many complex parameters you need to consider whenever you want to draw some conclusion or to provide some data. Just to give an example, we are very well aware about the indirect land use change, and therefore the ILUC factor per crop, per type of fuel is very known to the Commission, but of course we need also a clear policy process to arrive to the final conclusion. So whenever we will want to adopt the same methodology, for example, already adopted in California, we are ready. So we know to which level we need to consider the ILUC from different type of fuels. However, we are already looking forward. Maurizio asked me, what about the future? You see, this is another example of data that the GSE, so my colleagues in ISPRA, they are developing. So looking at the second generation, so for example, straw, that is no more competing with food and feed industry. What are the resources in Europe? These are, for example, a very clear picture whereby you see that there are some areas, including here the north of Italy, where potentially you do have a good basis for developing this kind of new biofuel, so biofuel economy and industry. So this is something that we are providing to the decision makers, and then it's up to them to decide, okay, we go in that direction or not. And the same we do not only for Europe. We have now produced the renewable energy map for Africa. So Govinda mentioned Africa. I do fully agree that we do need the mixture of resource, not just bioenergy, and to look where it is more competitive, where it is available, and this is what we need. So we as scientists, we are providing this type of information, not only in Europe, again, because it's not a European problem, it's a world problem. But it's important to know that also within Europe, we do have resources to develop a kind of innovative technology. These are just the resources, but if I do go on, then I can consider, for example, I would like to, here, for example, if you do want to consider what to do next, then you have two, in my view, two choices. Either you go to non-land resources, or you still continue to use land, but then you need to really go back to the land. You really need to understand how to get use of the land in a more appropriate way. And then you see, when we talk about second, third generation, non-land sources of bioenergy, of course you can use better exploit the waste. So manure or algae biofuels. This is another solution that of course we need to study, and this would let's say contribute to solve the problem. Or you need to rationalize the use of residues. Agricultural residues, as I said before, straw, as I mentioned before, but also forest residues. Again, we cannot expect to solve the problem double or triple the bioenergy with the forest residue. However, we can improve a lot the proper use of residues for creating energy. And this is again another optimization study that we are doing. Or reducing the food waste. So as we said before, we should also mention that the food consumption could be also reconsidered, and so is also an ethical and behavioral. So these are the possibilities for non-land sources, so let's say what do not compete with agriculture. Or we still want to go to use the lands, but then we need to consider that bioenergy is not per se saving carbon emission. It does save carbon emission if the total balance will result in a more sequestration of carbon in biomass. Okay? And this is very important, because otherwise you can consider bioenergy simply because carbon comes from nature is per se positive. It's not. So we need to do other. We can use plant energy crops on degraded land. Of course, if we start to implement on degraded land energy crops, this is something which is per se positive. Or we can increase grazing density to free up land for bioenergy or food crops. This could be another important contribution coming from some countries, as we heard already yesterday from Brazil. But this is something that we need to understand how to implement. Of course, we can increase the crop yields, but how? Because we should be very careful if we do not use too much fertilizer, and then again, we increase emissions, we increase some more polluting effects. Or we can even adopt a different policy for cutting forest. So again, we as a scientist, we are already studying, and I can show, for example, for the fertilizer, you see this is very clear. If you increase the use of fertilizer, in Africa, for example, where they do not use yet too much fertilizer, you do have an increase in yield. So let's say it would make sense. But if you do increase further the use of fertilizer in Europe or USA or developed countries, the net gain is very limited. So again, we need to consider, as Govinda said, that per country we could adopt different solutions. But we are providing the data, they do need to take decisions. And finally, for the forest, I just give a very short overview, but how many different solutions we can adopt if the policymaker will listen to us? Because, for example, cutting forest, you see the young trees, they grow faster. So let's say if you do cut forest and then you let the new trees to grow, you have an increased rate of sea sequestration. But of course you have an initial drop-off that should be compensated in a certain time. So again, if, as Anne said, we need fantasy, innovative policy. This is very important, because to cut forest means also to be strong politically, otherwise they kill you. But if you do have it, a right scientific base, so policy, then you can convince, and you should go ahead in developing, again, new technology, in developing new policy, however based on evidence. And this is the kind of evidence that we as JSC, we provide our colleagues within the European Commission, but also outside, member states and whoever. So again, there are many options to develop technology, to develop new policy. The important thing, as we said, that we need to work together, consider the different availability, and consider also the different mature level that some country has reached. So we cannot, as Govinda said, go for the same solution everywhere. But just to make something which puts some provocative, let's say, starting point for the future generation, second, third. So algae, non-land is okay, we can study, but we can also use other type of policy for the land use resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There are always many ways to face a problem. Yes. Mr. Stefan Brinto, I would like to go back to you, because you were very critical. So you almost said that it's impossible to provide food and energy with the first generation of bioenergy technology. Do you think that after this open windows on the future, are you more optimistic? Do you think that from those technology can come an answer that make possible to get both the target? I mean,
thank you, Maurizio. Well, actually, well, it was very important what my colleague said, and I can agree to most everything, and this fits into the whole picture. But it is not in conflict what I've said earlier. The point is that we don't have the time to become very technical here. But for those involved with the ILUC factor calculations, the key assumption seems to be, at least implicit, that food and non-food production for biofuels or what else is weighted equally. So if any expansion of land use and land conversion and land cover change is attributed to certain types of crops, this is before the background of ongoing land use change, and it is allocated in this terminology equally to the food and non-food. This implies that food provision and non-food provision has got the same priority. We do not value food production first priority in adopting this type of methodological approach. I think this should be made more explicit. And I very much like both of yours pleas that we should have a country-specific perspective and look at the different facets of each country. This is paramount of importance. At the same time, we need not and must not neglect the overall trends, because each country is affected by these trends and is interwoven by trade, increasingly global trade. And so we need also for countries like Tanzania an accounting system which shows what is the net land use within the country and also by imports and exports, so that the policymakers in Tanzania can also judge, well, do we have actually room? And do we decide on certain land use changes in our savannas? And do we make certain decisions that savanna should be converted or not? And that is their autonomous decision then. But we need this better knowledge in order, like Anne put it, to have a more science-based governance approach. And with regard to the, I'm grateful what Giovanni showed us. I think it is also worth considering that it is not just greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, this is a top priority. We need to take care about climate change, need to control that, mitigate, adapt. But there are other key issues, and I just suggested also the roadmap for resource efficiency could be taken as a kind of a reference in that. The roadmap, which is led forward by Janusz Potocznik, DG, the Environment Commissioner, and here they have drafted also what they call a dashboard of indicators comprising the most important relevant indicators. And I see some synergies in the indicator performance within the Commission and also beyond worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that Irini Malsog wants to react to.
I just wanted to put another couple of facts on the table. So talking about countries like Tanzania, as we were just saying, we could also think of two scenarios. One in which the country decides not to produce any bioenergy at all, and one in which it could look at it as an option, look at the country situation, and try and move towards some evidence and then decide whether to go forward. So that's one situation. Going back to the first case, in which it decides not to produce bioenergy at all locally. So it's not going to use, it's not going to develop bioenergy. It's not going to look at any way to use that to contribute to the development of the agriculture sector and local energy supply. Now, in this case, so no bioenergy, right? we know that the most important food crop in Tanzania is maize. So, although it doesn't develop any bioenergy domestically, still food security will be impacted in this country. Again, now there's another side to the story. So I'm not doing any bioenergy, but maize is my most important food crop, and the price of maize has been increasing. Is that good or is that bad? It depends on which household I am. Going down to the household level. Am I a net food consumer? So that means, do I buy most of my food? Well, in that case, it's going to be a problem for me because I'm going to have to spend more to buy my maize. Am I instead a farmer that can participate in the market? So am I a net producer? In that case, I could benefit from the increased price. I could start making a bit more profit from participating in this market. So there are different sides, again, to the story, even if I am not producing bioenergy. But my point is, saying I don't produce bioenergy at all in the country doesn't end the problem there. Still, there will be some impacts. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Van Steen wanted to say something. I please everyone to stay in 3 minutes because time is running.
I wanted to say a few words about the business about first generation versus second generation, because this is in fact something which is important, and there should be no doubt that from the Commission side we do favor second generation biofuels. We do think that that is going to be the future, but we do see first generation as the bridge towards that. And why do we think the second generation are better? Well, firstly, because there's no food fuel competition, because you're not using feedstocks that are used for food. And secondly, there is more efficiency in the production line. So we're trying to do that, and of course, in doing so, we need incentives, because that requires investment, that requires very, very large investments. And that's, of course, where policymakers come into the picture, because they need to create a climate in which those investments can take place. And we've heard, and I very much agree with what Anne said and others, that we need flexibility in that sustainability, and we update the criteria once we get new knowledge and so on. Of course we need to do that, but we also have to accept that we need to create a relatively stable investment climate for those people who are going to put a lot of money on the line in order to invest in whatever is needed to produce, for example, second and third generation biofuels. So we need to find the right balance between those two elements. And I think that is something which is very important. If I have 1 minute left, well, I have, because the moderator is talking. Just one quick comment to what Govinda said, which I think was very important, that of course biofuels is not the only solution. We are looking at a whole range of solutions, lots of different types of renewable types of energy. We also have other low carbon technologies available. Nuclear is one. Carbon capture and storage, so that we can continue to use fossil fuels, is another. We have produced from the Commission side recently a low carbon energy roadmap. The important point there, though, is that whatever you do in order to reduce your emissions, you will need a lot more renewable energy, and you will need a lot more bioenergy in order to do that, even if you consider in the future we will be able to go down a high nuclear future, or if we consider that carbon capture and storage for fossil fuels will become commercially available and widespread applied.
Thank you. Mr. Rosa?
My own 3 minutes. I'll try to give 3 ideas in 1 of each minutes. The first is, I think this debate brought in something which I think very important, which is the world dimension, the equity dimension, in this sense that whatever we decide at the European Union level, we must take into account the effect beyond the European Union. So if we are to be sustainable, we must be it in a worldwide way. The second point is the following. I think Anne Glover was very good in remembering us that all the energy we rely on is almost all is from solar energy. In fact, even fossil fuels or bioenergy somewhere in the past, it just takes too many million years to get them back. So in this set, for policy, whatever enhances our capacity to capture solar energy, we should pay attention. That's why second generation, third generation is a good idea. I would leave a word of caution, though, on replacing old trees by young trees, because there's not only this sink factor, there's also the reservoir factor, and old trees are usually a very good reservoir. My final point comes on science and policy, which I also pick from Anne Glover. She said that if we were to conduct our business only from evidence, this wouldn't be very interesting. My way to put it, we are not aiming to have a supercomputer somewhere in the future telling us what to do, because we are tackling with human sustainability. For planet sustainability, humans apart, we would only need time, some millions of years, and even biodiversity would be back. But for this, there is the certainty and investors by one side, the uncertainty and science by the other. Whatever we do must be compatible with science, but I think there's certainty enough for us to take better decisions on how to use bioenergy. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Forbegoni, in che modo si è mossa la Regione Lombardia? Lei insomma, ha una forte attività internazionale, in che modo si è mossa, in che modo si possono muovere le regioni, in qualche modo per partecipare, per coordinarsi rispetto a questa partita della green economy, dei biocombustibili e della green economy in particolare, perché sappiamo che poi su questa partita della green economy ci giochiamo anche un bel po' di sviluppo industriale, o almeno così dovrebbe essere.
Sì, io credo che soprattutto per le regioni più sviluppate sia fondamentale la capacità di stringere alleanze internazionali, di mettersi in rete con altri sistemi, di attivare confronti e di realizzare collaborazioni virtuose. Anzi, penso proprio che la discriminante tra l'immobilismo e lo sviluppo sia quello di creare reti tra territori che nel mondo hanno livelli di problematiche e di spinta verso la soluzione analoghe. La Regione Lombardia si è mossa in diverse direzioni, abbiamo un'alleanza storica da quasi 20 anni con i cosiddetti 4 regioni dell'Europa. Più recentemente abbiamo stretto un livello di collaborazione molto forte con i motori del Mercosur, che ci ha portato ad esempio a far partire una collaborazione molto forte sul piano scientifico con la Fondazione FADA di Córdoba in Argentina per un'attività di ricerca congiunta sulle biomasse, e da 3 anni abbiamo costruito la rete che abbiamo chiamato World Region Forum, la rete delle 17 regioni più dinamiche e più avanzate del mondo, soprattutto appunto sui temi della ricerca, della biosostenibilità, dell'innovazione, del trasferimento tecnologico, dell'ambiente e delle energie pulite. E poi vorrei citare, perché è straordinariamente utile, la collaborazione anche qui che abbiamo da anni con il JRC di Ispra. La Lombardia è la regione italiana che ha reso forte questa collaborazione anche attraverso la sottoscrizione di una convenzione, proprio perché la Lombardia è una delle regioni che soffre di più dell'inquinamento atmosferico a causa della particolare situazione orografica nella quale ci troviamo, circondati come siamo da montagne e quindi avendo un bassissimo ricambio d'aria. Quindi con il JRC collaboriamo da tempo, questo ci ha portato a fare politiche innovative nel corso degli anni, molto criticate queste nostre politiche quando le abbiamo assunte, molto apprezzate in seguito quando se ne sono visti i risultati. Siamo stati i primi ad esempio a introdurre i filtri antiparticolato, che venivano loro ritenuti costosi e inutili, ci siamo mossi verso il bifuel di seconda generazione, abbiamo lavorato sull'utilizzo delle biomasse, delle paglie, anche perché la pianura padana e la Lombardia sono ricche di questo materiale. Pochi giorni fa l'Organizzazione Mondiale della Sanità ha rivelato la particolare tossicità dei motori diesel. Bene, noi avevamo individuato assieme al JRC questa pericolosità già 10 anni fa e avevamo proposto delle politiche assolutamente innovative. Purtroppo queste politiche sono state bloccate dal governo italiano e dalla Commissione europea. Noi avevamo chiesto di poter bloccare sul territorio della Regione Lombardia la vendita di vetture diesel nuove. Non si trattava di spingere i cittadini a rottamare le vetture diesel già di loro possesso, né si trattava di impedire la circolazione in Lombardia di vetture diesel immatricolate altrove, ma di impedire la vendita. Noi eravamo profondamente convinti di questa innovazione. Oggi, con alcuni anni di distanza, l'Organizzazione Mondiale della Sanità ci dà ragione. Cito soltanto i 2 ultimi progetti nei quali siamo implicati a livello internazionale, che sono da una parte il progetto europeo sulle biomasse e bioenergies con altre 14 regioni europee e l'altra collaborazione molto ambiziosa che vogliamo realizzare per l'Expo 2015, fare dell'area di Milano e intorno a Milano la più grande area in cui circolino soltanto vetture elettriche. Abbiamo già contatto con una serie di case produttrici, ripeto, è un progetto molto ambizioso, ma contiamo di arrivarci.
Grazie, grazie Presidente. Ann Glover, which is leaving in a few minutes because she must take an airplane, which will be the message that that the European Commission will bring in Rio 20?
I don't know what the message should be, but I think one of the things that we should think about, and I kept on coming back to it in my own mind after listening to all the contributions, is that here in Europe, to sustain our current lifestyle with food and energy, we need 3 planets. We use 3 planets worth of resources every year to sustain our lifestyle. In North America, they require 5 planets worth. So it's just worth thinking that we talk about food and energy. We absolutely need food, energy. With the water equation we're not talking about today. But I think it's the plea for imaginative policy and joined up thinking. So I think in Rio Plus 20, always the way of politics, I think, and perhaps it's the human way, is that we think too often about what's best for me rather than what's best for us. And I think that it's okay to think about what's best for me if there's only a few million of us on the planet. But if there's 7 billion of us on the planet, you have to start thinking about other people. And I do think science is important here, because what science does is it describes the world we live in. It helps us to understand what's happening. It also allows us, by continued research, to reduce uncertainty, because science is all about uncertainty. That's why most scientists like to go to work every day, is because you just never know what's going to happen. It's exciting. But uncertainty to a politician is a horrible thing. They hate that. So you can see the problem of scientists speaking to politicians, because one of them loves uncertainty, the other one hates it. But I think scientists can do very much more in translating uncertainty into potential action. We should never let uncertainty freeze us into inactivity. So politicians need to embrace a bit of that uncertainty and be imaginative. And for that to happen, actually, we all have a role. And I would include everybody in the room here. Because how many times have you said about a policy being changed, oh, they didn't get it right, it's a U-turn, or that politician's changed their mind, that's a bad thing. It can't be a bad thing. It's a good thing if, in the light of changing evidence, we review what we do. We need to do it carefully, so we can't always be changing from one thing to another. But I think in Rio Plus 20, the politicians who are there, they need to start thinking about how do we deliver a secure future for human beings on the planet. Because I'm a natural optimist, and the optimist way of looking at this is if we get it horribly wrong and we don't manage to deal with man-made climate change, actually the planet will be fine. And I'm by background a microbiologist. Microbes will be absolutely fine. It's humans on the planet that will have a problem. It will be horrible for us. So it's it really is a big challenge, but we do need to look at every issue. And it's not just looking at bioenergy. I really think we always have to come back to food and how we use our land on the planet. And I'll leave you with just one thought. 40% of food crops are lost prior to harvesting due to pest and disease or whatever. 40% is lost. If we reduce that by just 1%, we could feed 25 million people for a year. So in our policies, we need to think about intensifying or sustainable intensification of agriculture, but we need to think about smart agriculture and smart fuel production. I would leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, very wise words. Thank you. Now I want to go back to Mr. Tim Elsina, which I know he wants to react to some of the things that we have said here today. But I have a question for you. I think it's important. You said that, and also Faust seems to think in the same way, that we must be very careful and identify different policies for different countries. So this means that we'll never have a common rule in the world. Is it a chimera to rule this industry in a, coherent way all around the world?
Let me clarify just two of the issues I heard before. Yes. Hence you mentioned about this second generation and the first generation. Let me clarify, and we understood quite a lot, over the research, in the past couple of years, is that second generation biofuel not necessarily, evade all the problems. There are still some problems. For example, the food versus, fuel crisis. Whenever we go and talk to the private sector, so who are the, main market driver, nobody talks about the agricultural residues to produce biofuels. They talk energy, density crops, energy crops, miscanthus, switchgrass, and so on. Whenever we talk about this, non-food crops, that means we are competing on land. So the land competition always exists there, unless we produce food and fuel from the same crops. This is just a clarification. And Stephen, you mentioned about this international trade, and it's a very interesting thing. That's why we are talking about ILUC, and that's why we are worried about what happened in the developing world. So because of the international trade, when we have a biofuel mandate in the EU, and we need to worry about there is a deforestation in Malaysia and Indonesia, that is why, because of the international trade. That's why what we need, I'd like to add one more rule, is a regulation. In many developing countries, it's not only market, it's a regulated market, what we need for the biofuel development. So in many African countries, so they randomly introduce the policies, okay, no biofuel from the corn, no biofuel from the sugarcane. It's more on the random basis without any, serious or thorough investigation. For example, in Zambia, so we produce a lot of corn. It's one of the biggest producers of the corn. And so they say that, no, don't talk about biofuel and corn. This is our staple food. We don't want to touch it. Now this year, they have a huge surplus of the corn. What they are going to do? So if there is some limited capacity for producing the biofuel from the, the surplus crops, they could do it. So that means that's why, I like to, highlight that, again, I'll come back to your point, is that, it's not only country specific, it's a case specific. It's a case specific as well. So we are all talking about the same thing, so we worried about the climate change. We are worrying about this, energy security. That's why we are talking about the biofuels. But, so we know that, the overall objective is very clear. It's a common. It's a global. But how we implement it, so it could be different. So it could be country specific. It could be case specific. So that, That's the answer to your questions. And again, I like to highlight this. It's a regulated market. It's very important. It's not only the market, it's a regulated market. And as a World Bank, as a EU, we have some responsibility to provide the capacity in developing countries, how they can build, how they can institutionalize the regulatory mechanism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So I would like to, I think it's the moment for the conclusion, so if you wanted to conclude this session.
Thank you, Maurizio. Well, I don't want to add that much because we heard already many considerations, and to make conclusions difficult. But what I could say is simply this. I personally enjoy very much being a scientist and a researcher to see how cautious, how correct, how open this time we are following, in a way to come to a conclusion, to a decision for bioenergy, which could be adopted for any kind of other type of resources, before we take actions. This is something that I like very much. I must say that we have a very open discussion within the Commission, but also outside the international community. Today you heard different points of view from different international stakeholders, from implementers, so region, member states, Commission, and this is the best guarantee that, again, the solution, whatever will be, let's say, based on evidence, based on reflection, real sustainable. That's the key word. And again, today in the afternoon, we will deep this discussion. We'll try to understand who does what, why they do this instead of that, what are the pros and cons on different measures. And this is why I invite you all to come. I would like simply to finish by thanking again the different people who did make this possible. So the Expo 2015, and President Formigoni, because they wanted to host this debate, reinvigorating this kind of willingness to always to put forward, let's say, discussion on the future rather than looking backwards, looking forwards. I also thank again the organizer for the European Biomass Conference, having provided the forum and having provided the support to do it, and of course to all the colleagues who did work a lot to prepare the discussion, the speakers who did come and they provide their very useful view. And again, I wish you to have this kind of in-depth discussion this afternoon, looking how it can be really implemented, because in the end we need to do something, and the implementation is where the devil is. So thank you very much, and see you this afternoon.
Thank you. Non ci sono avvisi. Next session, 2:30. It's not this room. It's I think the yellow room. It's 2 rooms in that direction. Thank you.